we have this myth in our culture that sex is supposed to be spontaneous.
So there's a preconceived notion that single people have more sex than married people do. I actually think married people have more sex. But is it the single mom? Is it the married mom? Is it the CEO? Who's having more time in the bedroom?
Well, when we look at the differences between men and women, what we know to be the case is that the hormone that allows women to enjoy sex, having sex is one thing, enjoying sex is another, is oxytocin. And when women are stressed, oxytocin levels are low. So the more stressed a woman is, the more overworked a woman feels, the more in a hurry and a greater sense of urgency in her life, the less oxytocin she's going to have. So she's not being able to enjoy sex. Often single people will brag about how much sex they're having, and I'm talking more from the male point of view, and they are having a lot of sex when they first get into a relationship. Because when you first join a relationship, there's a newness and a lack of history. So newness and a lack of history stimulates huge amounts of oxytocin because the woman's kind of in a fantasy land, the man's in a fantasy land. We don't have a history yet of being disappointed, or the reality hasn't set in. So often when single people couple up in a serious in-love relationship, they have a lot of sex for a while, and generally that tapers down. But it doesn't mean we can't continue to have passionate, loving sex. I've been married 28 years and have great sex, but clearly when I was courting my wife, we had a lot more sex then.
What do you think? You deal with couples that deal with infidelity. Like, how are they doing?
Well, that's kind of a different question, because recovering from infidelity brings up a whole new spectrum of issues. But I think that we long for someone in this space in between us. Attraction happens in that space. So we want someone who's over there. And if they're sitting next to us on the couch every night, not so much. So sometimes there's more of a spark if you're single and you're still in that space where there's an attraction, because you're not totally together and merged yet. But that being said, sex also happens because of opportunity. If you're living with someone and you're there all the time, there's a lot more opportunity for that connection to happen. But I agree with John, if there's a space for an emotional connection first, women have a tendency to want that first in order to have sex. And what I see is that men have sex in order to have an emotional connection. So sometimes, there's there's that crossover that's hard to, climb over in the middle of the bed.
Yeah.
Well, and I think I work with a lot of singles, and what I think happens is that they have a lot of sex in the beginning, they're exploring themselves, and then it gets to the point where they make a decision they want to get married. And that's probably the worst position to be in, because you're now forced to look for Mr. Right, and you sort of have this hyper control over your sexuality, and you're really trying to find the one. And a lot of times they suppress that sexual urge and that need, and then they'll end up having these one-night stands every once in a while and feel a lot of guilt afterwards. And so there's a lot of this idea, almost like you're saving yourself now, and you want to be the good girl now, and so there's a little conflict there. And so they stop. They claim they want to have sex, but they don't want to just have a fling anymore.
Well, why do we think single people have more sex than married people? I mean, that's a really common sort of misconception in the media. What do you think?
Well, I think actually, just going back to what you were saying before, is I don't know that it's a single or married thing. Actually, just depends on your levels of stress. And I work a lot with entrepreneurial women, right, who aren't in corporate America, who aren't necessarily staying at home. And generally, they've taken their schedule, or they've taken their well-being into their own hands. And so they have a lot more say-so how much, how, when, how much they're enjoying. They can certainly fall into the trap of, now I'm my own boss and I'm just going to be as stressed as I was in corporate. But usually, I'd say they're having the most and the best quality sex.
Says the entrepreneur.
Says the entrepreneur. That's right.
Well, I think, we have this myth in our culture that sex is supposed to be spontaneous. And I can tell you that if you're working a full-time job and you have a family and a house, you're not going to come home and sweep the dishes off the kitchen table and say, "Take me now." I mean, that's never going to happen. That sex doesn't have to be spontaneous. It probably wasn't even when you were dating. You knew okay, we're going to get together tonight, so I'm going to wear, good
Well, on
underwear
date night.
and shave my legs. The reality is you can be as spontaneous as you want if you plan it. You can plan a sex night. That's not a date night. That's not going out to dinner and eating rich food and drinking wine, because you're going to come home and go to sleep. That's not sex night. But if you plan one night a week to carve out for our sacred erotic night, that's not the roommate stuff, the companionship, the daily management of your lives together. It's the time when this is when we can be as spontaneous as we want within this time that has to do with us, that makes us more than just roommates.
So what it looks like here is that couples are having more sex than singles. Sorry, single people. But sex does naturally change the longer you're together. Create some space, create some distance, plan it out. Wear your good underwear.
Just in case.